In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Welcome, Sublation media viewers, Sublation Magazine readers, Sublation books readers, and Sublation Sublators. I am Douglas Lane, host of this stream. With me today is my new co-host, Benjamin Studebaker. This is the first Benjamin Studebaker episode, so it's a moment of celebration. Ben, do you want to introduce yourself, give your bio, give you your social security number?
Sure. So I'm originally from Indiana in the States. I did my bachelor's in politics at the University of Warwick in the UK, my master's at the University of Chicago in the States, and then my PhD at the University of Cambridge. I've written a couple books. One of them is The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way Is Shut, and the other one is Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, which just came out with Edinburgh University Press.
Yeah, and I want to hear more about that second book. Maybe you should come on the Diet Soap podcast as well as the Sublation Magazine stream, and perhaps you'll have some reasons to bring up your second book in this very stream. It seems like maybe it's relevant. Today we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about two big stories that are out there right now. One of them is the assassination of the UnitedHealthcare CEO, Brian Thompson. And the other, more exciting story from where I'm sitting, is the drones over New Jersey story. I have a prepared set of remarks and some clips and all sorts of things to present to everybody. But before I do that, Benjamin, have you been following both these stories? And more importantly, have you been following the drones over New Jersey story? Have you seen any drones in Indiana? What do you make of this story?
Oh, I have heard whispers of it, but I'm sure you are much more thoroughly detailed in your analysis of it than I could possibly be. It's something which I can't imagine how a sci-fi novelist wouldn't be drawn into the possibility of it. It's just too enticing. It's like a brightly colored flower that you just have to orbit.
Yeah, no, it's it's like a drug that I can't stay away from. My girlfriend Fran, tells me that she would like me to change the topic from time to time. So listen, I'm just going to jump in here on this little essay I wrote. It's kind of a rough essay about how I'm struggling to frame both of these stories and keep my wits about me. So the way I'm thinking of it is this: the 2024 election can be understood as a referendum on legacy media. Kamala Harris and the Democrats had the support of CNN, MSNBC, Hollywood, the LA Times, like all the newspapers, even the Washington Post, despite the lack of an official endorsement. And in retrospect, it was understood as a battle between TV and the internet, even as the Harris campaign launched from Twitter and TikTok and kind of aimed to keep the election on the level of vibes and memes. But after the election of Trump, the Democrats were left to wonder what had gone wrong. And one of the conclusions they reached was that they'd ceded alternative media to the dissident right, ceded the internet to the dissident right, and they needed to regain control of the narratives that were dominating society. And this was expressed, this need to maintain or regain control was expressed as a need to create their own left-wing version of Joe Rogan. However, recently the novelist Walter Kern has suggested that the way they've actually attempted to solve the problem of controlling the narratives in society was through the construction of pseudo-events. And to give an example of what he thinks the Democrats are doing, he referred to Sidney Lumet's film Network from 1976 that was written by Patty Chayefsky. The movie takes what was a satirical look at television news. Today, the black comedy seems more realistic. It depicts the death of journalism as pseudo-events and spectacles replace reality. And in one segment, a network executive played by Faye Dunaway signs a Maoist terrorist organization to create a series called the Mao Zedong Hour. And I thought I'd run a clip from that. So here's that clip if I can find it. Here it is.
The Mao Zedong Hour went on the air March 14th. It received a 47 share. The network promptly committed to 15 shows with an option for 10 more. There were the usual contractual difficulties.
Equal to 20%.
I'm lousy $2.15 per segment. I'm already depositing $25,000 a week with Metro. I'm paying William Morris 10% off the top. And I'm giving this turkey $10,000 per segment, another 5 for this fruitcake.
Man, give her the fucking overhead clause.
Let's get back to page 22. 5, small a, subsidiary rights.
So this is the scene that Walter Kern had suggested we should keep in mind as we watch the news of the assassination of the UnitedHealthcare CEO fill our feeds and screens. What this is, according to Kern, and I agree, is a pseudo-event in the style of the Mao Zedong Hour. Some other examples of pseudo-events would include obvious things like the Live Aid concert from 1985 or Hands Across America. I only make references to things from the 80s, but here's what that Hands Across America looked like. More recently, the Taylor Swift endorsement of Kamala might be a pseudo-event. But another example of a pseudo-event that we should keep in mind would be the Russiagate scandal. That example might be controversial, but given that the allegation of collusion was invented by the Clinton campaign, the Steele dossier, the document that sparked the investigation, was a product of oppositional research bought and paid for by Clinton before the 2016 election. And given that the likelihood that the investigation by Mueller would never lead anywhere other than a dead end, I would contend that the scandal was a pseudo-event that aimed to produce media coverage to create a damaging narrative for Trump, but nothing more. And again, another pseudo-event, according to Walter Kern, would be this assassination of Brian Thompson, the CEO of UnitedHealthcare. The narrative we're being sold is that a young and good-looking man named Luigi Mangione sought revenge or justice after the company turned down his claim for coverage after he suffered a back injury. And this back injury was really awful. It left him unable to perform sexually, which, having looked at his abs, everyone's very depressed about that. He is said also to have suffered from a brain fog and is being hailed as a folk hero by Democratic Party-aligned commentators and radical leftists online. But by declaring that Luigi is a folk hero, the media is also declaring him guilty, forgoing the principle of presumed innocence. Even worse, we are being led to approach the task of understanding the world, to approach what's called sense-making by sociologists, to the level of a pseudo-activity. In 1961, Daniel Boorstin worried that Americans were living in illusions. Daniel Boorstin is the author and historian who coined the phrase pseudo-events. I think he wrote a book in 1961. It was entitled The Image. Anyway, we are at risk of mistaking our own lives, myths, and stories about the we're at risk of mistaking images of our lives, myths that we make up, and stories about the world for reality. Today, the notion that we should strive to know the truth, that the news should be about the world outside of the production studio or beyond the computer screen has been abandoned. Our news people don't report on what is, but about what people are believing. That is, by telling us what we believe, they tell us what we should believe. And here's an example of that from MSNBC.
This Luigi Mangione, he's like sort of now everywhere. There's people celebrating him, all on saying, don't catch him, all that sort of thing. He did have his arraignment today, and he stood up and yelled something about, this is just, it's unfair, it's not right, yada, yada, yada. He was walking, there he goes, walking in today. He yelled something about, there he goes. Sort of turning himself into sort of a folk hero, right? And leaning into that. He's probably richer than the guy that he killed. His family, he has generational wealth.
Yes.
So he probably was wealthier
Yes.
than the CEO that he killed.
Yes. This is Lex Luthor killing a stormtrooper, right? Like he and here's the thing. The humanity of this is that no matter how much money you have, you can still be taken advantage of by our unfair healthcare system.
That's right.
All the money in the world can't fix a broken back. All the money in the world can't save your grandmother. That's where my empathy comes through.
Sure.
But the attitude that, well, if I can't get things my way, or if I am in pain, that singular violence is the way to go, is a level of privilege that the vast majority of people in America suffering can't exact.
The system is broken. Insurance companies are bilking us. UnitedHealthcare is that big for a reason. They're being sued for a reason. But like you said, they'll just replace him with another CEO and keep doing it to you. But regulation would actually fix it. They're against that.
This is very real for you and me and everybody else who does anything. This person worked alone. I sincerely believe he very likely worked alone.
Sure.
And any crazy person who views somebody as the genesis of all their problems can go out and do this. And that's what happens when you have a country that worships violence and a country where you don't regulate guns.
Right, exactly.
Because if you couldn't get access to guns, this probably doesn't happen.
The majority of the voters in this country just elected to run America like UnitedHealthcare.
Yeah.
This country will now be run the same way UnitedHealthcare is. Vicious cost cutting, merciless cost cutting, cutting people's benefits, cutting veterans' benefits, refusing care, taking away Obamacare. That is UnitedHealthcare.
All right. So, that was a mix of comments, but beneath it all, I think the most important message conveyed was that the Trump administration is UnitedHealthcare. That we got at the end. And it's part of the overall narrative, which I think is aiming to shift our attention away from the incoming Trump administration, but also a variety of other political events and onto this pseudo-event. Here are the facts as they've been presented to us on video so far. 12 days ago, that is on December 4th, Brian Thompson was shot dead outside the entrance to the New York Hilton Midtown Hotel. A surveillance camera outside the hotel captured the murder, and the footage was distributed widely. On the surveillance video, a man wearing a dark hoodie, dark slacks, and a brown backpack stepped out from between parked cars and shot Thompson with a pistol as Thompson walked towards the entrance with his back turned towards his assailant. The shooter had been waiting between parked cars for about 30 minutes. He wore a mask and used a silencer on his pistol. The weapon failed to feed the next round and had to be manually cleared after the first shot. It had to be reloaded several times in between shots, perhaps due to the silencer. Nonetheless, many speculated that this had been a professional hit. In the original surveillance footage, the shooter's face was not visible. More footage was discovered of the shooter arriving by subway at the scene a half hour before the shooting, but again, the shooter's face was not visible in the footage. Later on, a still from the police distributed, a photo from the police was distributed, and it showed a man in a hooded jacket. The photo was said to be of a man who was a suspect in the shooting. One of the photos depicted this man smiling, and it was reported that he'd been flirting with a clerk at the hostel where he was staying. 5 days after that, or after the shooting, the police arrested Luigi Mangione at McDonald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania. It was reported that Mangione was carrying a 3D printed pistol with a 3D printed silencer attached. He had a short handwritten letter addressed to the feds, or it was called a manifesto. The letter criticized the American healthcare system and began with these two lines. To the feds, I'll keep this short because I do respect what you do for our country. To save you a lengthy investigation, I state plainly that I wasn't working with anyone. According to the Colorado Springs Gazette, that's a newspaper in my hometown, Mangione has claimed that evidence was planted on him after his arrest. His lawyer in Pennsylvania informed the press that Mangione was contesting his extradition to New York and that he would be pleading not guilty to second-degree murder charges. No single narrative should be attached to this sequence of events, I think. Luigi Mangione was not a customer of UnitedHealthcare. Brian Thompson, along with being the CEO of a hated healthcare company known for denying claims, was also set to testify in front of the DOJ on allegations of insider trading. Of course, if we can't know whether Luigi Mangione is the assassin, we certainly don't have enough information to determine just why the assassination took place. but it's worthwhile, I think, to take up Walter Kern's assertion that the killing and the coverage of it should be understood as linked. That is, we should consider what it would mean if the murder of Brian Thompson was a pseudo-event. Again, a pseudo-event is a staged event that is aimed primarily at the media. It's aimed at gaining media attention. PR hacks and governmental agencies use pseudo-events to shape public perception, to put forward a narrative. The point is to not only change the way we think, but to shift us from living in reality to living in an illusion. As Borston put it, we risk being the first people in history to have been able to make their illusions so vivid, so persuasive, so realistic that they can live in them. We're the most illusioned people on earth. Yet we dare not become disillusioned, because our illusions are the very house in which we live. They are our news, our heroes, our adventure, our forms of art, our very experience. So this brings me to the other story that is dominating the news, the story I started out talking about. It's a story that the algorithms have decided should be linked to the UnitedHealthcare killing, at least whenever I'm presented with information on my feed. These two things seem to come together. That would be the mystery drone story. And 4 days ago, the Pentagon addressed this story at a pseudo-event, at a press conference. Here's a clip of that.
Sabrina, can you tell me what the Pentagon is doing to address this issue of drone sightings over New Jersey? It's near sensitive installations. The FBI is involved. What is the Pentagon doing?
Sure. So at this time, aware of those drone sightings that have been reported, at this time we have no evidence that these activities are coming from a foreign entity or the work of an adversary. We're going to continue to monitor what is happening, but at no point were our installations threatened when this activity was occurring. These are not U.S. military drones. Again, this is being investigated by local law enforcement. What our initial assessment here is that these are not drones or activities coming from a foreign entity or adversary.
Representative Jeff Van Drew, who is a Republican from New Jersey, was just on the air saying that Iran launched a mothership probably about a month ago that contains these drones, and that mothership is off the coast of the east coast of the United States. Is there any truth to that?
There is not any truth to that. There is no Iranian ship off the coast of the United States, and there's no so-called mothership launching drones towards the United States.
So, being a science fiction writer, I can't help but put this in the context of the David Grush story, the testimony from a year ago. I made a Critical Cuts video when David Grush, who was an intelligence officer, stepped forward to tell the world that not only were the UFOs real, but we had, or the U.S. government had crashed UFOs in hangars, that they had bodies of aliens in refrigerators, and that this had been known by the government for possibly a century. I made a Critical Cuts video trying to keep my own, tendency to just run toward illusion in check. It was a video about PSYOPs, and here's a clip from that. They were unwilling to go through the lengthy vetting process publication in the New York Times or the Washington Post would require. Instead, the article about a former intelligence officer named David Grush was rushed out, and Grush himself was booked on the relatively new cable channel News Nation. Overall, the combination of a blog entry and an appearance on a still largely unknown cable channel gave the impression that the whole story was an elaborate prank.
These are retrieving non-human origin technical vehicles, call it spacecraft if you will, non-human, exotic origin vehicles that have either landed or crashed.
We have spacecraft from another species.
We do, yeah.
How many?
Quite a number.
You're kidding.
No. When you recover something that's either landed or crashed, sometimes you encounter dead pilots. And believe it or not, as fantastical as that sounds, it's true.
This isn't a news story. It's what a news story would look like if it was produced for a low-budget Netflix original. And yet, the story was picked up by more reputable outlets, including New York Magazine, The Guardian, Newsweek, and the Daily Mail. But even as these news organizations reported on the story, they kept the tone light and remained skeptical. Vox reporter Andrew Prokop summed up the story this way. The phrase, "whoa, if true," was coined for a situation like this, especially the if true part. What nobody did, at least initially, was investigate or even speculate on what the story meant if it wasn't true. The term PSYOP was tossed around occasionally, but the meaning of the story as a PSYOP was not investigated.
So what does this tell us? What do we learn here? First, we learn that Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort, they all knew the Russian government wanted to elect Trump.
According to the RAND Corporation's Handbook for Tactical Operations in the Information Environment, the purpose of a deception is not just to trick someone. The purpose is to cause an adversarial decision maker to take actions or inactions harmful to themselves and favorable to you. PSYOPs aim to either increase or decrease ambiguity. If the target of a PSYOP is already behaving as you prefer, making a mistake, the deception story and related events should be designed to decrease ambiguity to prevent a change in this behavior. Deception stories that increase ambiguity are designed to confuse, mislead, and stress the target to prevent an accurate assessment of your intent, location, or capabilities. When considering David Grush's supposed whistleblowing as a PSYOP, it seems likely that the deception is meant to increase rather than decrease ambiguity. After all, the tale of crashed alien spacecraft retrieved by the United States, while apparently simple, in fact leads one into a morass of conflicting and far-out stories. The literature on flying saucers posits all manner of alien species, all manner of origin stories. Given how the field of ufology is a swamp of strangeness, how the advocates for the story of alien visitation will claim just about anything, responding to the story of extraterrestrial contact and crashed ships does not lead to any particular action, but is more likely to lead receivers of the propaganda to feel confused, afraid, and strange. In Adam Curtis's 2016 film, Hypernormalization, he explained the Russian form of psychological warfare called political technology. And in the film, he suggested that political technology had migrated from the east to the west. What is political technology? It is quite simply the use of deceptions aimed at creating ambiguity. The aim of those who deploy political technology is not just to make a particular decision or action more difficult. When aimed at the whole population, these Russian-style PSYOPs are meant to push the whole of society into a hazy mist. So there's a comment there at the end that maybe echoes what I'm about to say. It seems to me that as a socialist, the best approach to these stories, the story of the assassination, the drone story, David Crutch's testimony that the aliens have landed, is to think them both, or all three of them, as pseudo-events. We should not, as one of my friends on Twitter suggested, try to choose between them. It's not the case, as a friend named Joel tweeted, that the drone story is fake and gay, while the Luigi story is helping to rechannel our ire towards the real bad guys, which would be the corporate executives in the healthcare industry. Instead, I think socialists in the media might aim to investigate and understand just how law enforcement, the Department of Defense, these tech companies, and the legacy media operate together, either directly or systematically, to produce these illusions and the larger illusion that defines contemporary life. So I'm done. I got through it all. Ben, you can finally speak and not just be eye candy. What do you have to say?
Well, I think that the center tends to view the post-2008, post-2016, post-2020, wherever you want to start it, crisis of American democracy as mainly a function of lack of control over the discourse. And so your initial framing of TV versus the internet being an uncontrolled zone that has drifted out of the control of the center, I think that is the kind of standard centrist narrative of what has happened, is that it's primarily a discursive problem, that there's a lack of control over the internet, and that lack of control has allowed bad actors to disseminate nefarious and unhelpful stuff. I think one of the things that we should be doing is looking at material causes, things that have happened objectively that would produce discontents, rather than take it up at the level of discourse, which is where the center wants it all to be. The center wants us to get into a cultural struggle over control of language and terms and narratives, in part because that doesn't touch anything. And this might be one of the functions of what you describe as pseudo-events, to get us into a kind of language argument about whether murder is okay or not okay, or justified or not justified, depending on who's being murdered, depending on which political issue it is or isn't tied to try to turn something that was a very substantive issue, that was very much rooted in quite serious material problems with the healthcare sector, in terms of its size, 17% of GDP, in terms of the quality of care that people who are lower income, who have lower quality insurance receive, in terms of the paperwork and the waste and all of that, to take that issue and turn it into a kind of culture war, navel-gazing, moralizing issue about whether murder is or isn't okay because the target of the murder is a healthcare executive, or the person accused of the murder is a good-looking young Italian man. This is a way of taking something which was potentially a material issue that we could discuss in material terms and organize on the basis of, and turn it into another one of these stupid culture war games that is just a question of side taking and who the enemy is, and arguing over the physical people or physical groups that are going to get the blame for something which is structural that we don't actually approach or deal with.
Well,
I agree and don't agree, in the sense that I think you're right that there is a kind of distracting aspect to this and a kind of confusing aspect to it. But also I think that we should be skeptical of the centrist narrative, that it is primarily a question of narratives and a question of language and control over the internet. Because if it's framed in those terms, if it really is just a question of do they control the internet or not, and there's nothing else really going on, then we don't have much to organize on the basis of.
Well, I have two thoughts in response to what you just said. One is that when you say a material issue, the other way you could frame it is as a policy debate, because in the past, the way, like with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in 2016 and 2020, the question was should we have a public option? Should we have Medicare for all? Just how can we expand healthcare coverage for more Americans through the state? And so when people think about addressing these material conditions, often enough they think about those policies, particularly Medicare for all, right? And this is indeed a way to turn away from that debate and frame it differently. Although I think someone like my friend Joel, who tweeted out about this, might think that this story will eventually shift the Overton window so that now we can relitigate the question of Medicare for all and put pressure on our politicians to finally do something about the broken U.S. healthcare system.
Right. That Overton window crap, that's the language of treating it as purely a terminological thing. It's just a question of getting the narrative, getting enough news cycles where we talk about the thing as if that's political action. Part of what's gone on is that the American state has become so incapable of doing anything and so incapable of actually solving problems that it has to pretend that all of this discussion and frothing garbage is actual politics, is meaningful political action. That if you win enough news cycles in a row, or you manage to get different parts of the media talking about an issue for enough news cycles in a row, or enough news cycles in a span of 365 days, that eventually something will come of that, something will happen because there's chattering going on. And there's an assumption there that the conversation is in some way connected to something actually eventually taking place. Now, I think that in terms of, the Bernie movement and Medicare for all, there are ways of trying to elevate that and go, well, you're making demands on the Democratic Party. Is that really where you should be making the demands? Is there a way of organizing for it that would be more effective than, say, supporting Bernie Sanders in an attempt to take over the Democratic Party? And you could try to push that argument somewhere that would be more interesting. But I think what this does is it regresses the whole thing into let's find individuals and groups to blame for the healthcare system and make them enemies. And then let's turn the healthcare issue into a public order question. So now it's about crimes, and it's about, do you like vigilante justice? And it's become very far removed from anything that would be to do with actually working on the healthcare problem. We could talk about what's a better or worse way to politically organize with regard to healthcare, but this is not that. This has almost nothing to do with the question of healthcare, apart from the fact that ostensibly the guy was killed for reasons to do with being a healthcare CEO. But outside of that, here's a person who's been brutalized and barbarized in various ways by his life experience, doing something that very few people statistically are going to do. It's not as if all of these people who are tweeting about how much they support him are going to go and do things similar to what he's doing, right? And then B, even if they did go and do things that are similar to what he's doing, this would just result in an enormous amount of state repression. It would create a sharper antagonism between people who are demanding healthcare and people who maintain public order. And ultimately, if you want to do some kind of revolution, you have to create a harmony between the people who are striking, demonstrating, taking political action, and the soldiers. The soldiers have to sympathize with the people who are taking the action. So if you have a perception among the soldiers that the people who are taking the action are lawless chaos, agents of chaos, who will produce a dangerous situation where people's lives, basic order will be called into question, then it becomes easier to order those soldiers to discipline the demonstrators and the people taking action. So I don't see any mechanism by which this would turn into a politics. And what's worse, I don't even see an interest in trying to talk through that. If you raise the question of, is this a meaningful politics, people get mad at you for ruining their fun, because this is a culture war game at this stage.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that this is anti-political. The way the story has been taken up is certainly opportunistic and aimed at, or has if it isn't consciously designed to suppress political thinking, then it is for some structural reason coming out that way. But what I wonder about is the connection between the Russiagate scandal and this story that Walter Kern raised, and that I have tried to think through with this little essay a bit, because it does seem to me, I mean, at least coincidentally, it is arising in this moment of transition between the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration. And the last time Trump got elected, the Democrats did concoct a pseudo-event to try to do damage to him and to the presidency. And along the way, they did damage to the First Amendment, to our relationship with Russia, increased tensions there. And I think they did damage to the public's sense-making ability. Damage that was at least as bad as the way the Bush administration handled the war on terror, pushing forward kind of confused stories, trying to have it every which way, and starting a war based on what, if you paid attention, you would have already known was a false premise, mainly that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So do you think this might be some sort of pseudo-event that's in line with the Russiagate scandal, a way to do politics through culture war and kind of illusory narratives?
Well, I usually operate from the premise that whether it's happening for market reasons because this is what people are buying, because this is what people are clicking on, or because someone has tried to make it into a thing, some agent of the state or some particular corporate actor, that's something that in practice will be very difficult to prove. But I think generally, if you treat it as a structural issue and you treat it as a function of market forces algorithms, rather than as some kind of plot or scheme, it invites people to think about problems in a more structural way. And part of the trouble with these culture war issues is that they are an attempt to concretize the abstract. They're an attempt to take a structural problem and make it about personalities and about who's good and who's bad and who can be blamed. And for that reason, when I don't have enough information to judge or to know whether something is a plan or is something which has just happened through impersonal incentive structures, I tend to lean toward impersonal incentive structures. I think people tend to think better about these events when they're thinking in terms of impersonal incentive structures.
Well, maybe this would be a good point to segue into a conversation about this article that was in Sublation Magazine called "A Victory for Covid Policy Skeptics," because I think the critique that this essay written by Toby Green and Thomas Fazi is attempting would be one where both incentive structures arising out of the market or the development of capitalism and political actors with their own ideological intentions are coming together in a way that they would argue is a bit obscure to dissident leftists like myself and like you, that maybe we might be missing the way in which there's continuity between the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration, that, there's a critique of this particular moment, this post-neoliberal moment, as being neo-feudal, run by the big tech companies and the sort of the hyper-administrated society and state. And Trump has been seen, and the people on the Trump team have been seen as sort of striking a blow against the bureaucrats and the administrators. And yet in this article by Toby Green and Thomas Fazi, they point out that Peter Thiel and I guess this guy Mencius Goldbug and J.D. Vance are all just kind of conservative populist versions of neo-feudalist politics or politicians. So I wonder if you agree that this is still a major risk in the incoming Trump administration, and if you think that we can think about these structural forces and along with political actors with their own ideologies together, as I think they're doing in this piece.
Well, in that piece, what struck me is that the initial conversation about COVID doesn't include any kind of citations or evidence. It's really a handshake done on the premise that the people who are reading it share broadly the same view of COVID, right? Then when it turns to the criticism of the Trump administration, all of a sudden there are lots of links to things. So the aim in that piece is to reach out to people who are critical of the Biden administration on COVID and to say to those people, yeah, you may be critical about the Biden administration, but nonetheless, you should be concerned about Trump. And there's much more time, effort, and energy put into the trying to create the concern about Trump. And a significant amount of it has to do with Vance. So there's a claim there that Vance is obviously the person who stands to inherit this movement, which is not obviously the case. And then secondly, that Vance is essentially Curtis Yarvin, that Vance espouses or embodies the politics of Curtis Yarvin? Now, what's interesting is that there are a lot of people on the kind of post-liberal right who think of themselves as having some kind of relationship with Vance and influence with him. It's not just one particular person. And there are lots of different people on the right who claim some kind of influence over Vance. Vance has done a very good job of persuading many, many, many people that they have influence with him. But they can't all have the same amount of influence with him at the same time. And then also, even insofar as he might be a vector for one of them in particular, it's not clear that he is the person who will dominate the MAGA movement going forward. These claims that are being made are, I think, about trying to make sure that even if we are critical of the Biden administration, we don't become uncritically supportive of the Trump administration. And I think that's a fine objective. But I do think that the piece is quite selective in terms of the claims that it chooses to back up with evidence versus those it doesn't. And then I also think that it is quick to make certain very strong claims about the character of the MAGA movement that I am not so sure are true.
Well, yeah, the link between Yarvin and Vance is Peter Thiel, right? That's the Thiel money that Vance received.
Right. But Thiel gives money to an enormous number of organizations that are quite different from one another. Are they all secretly Curtis Yarvin? Yeah, it seems an odd claim to make that anybody who gets Thiel bucks must espouse the politics of Curtis Yarvin. I mean, does anybody who gets Soros bucks necessarily espouse his politics? I don't think we can be so straightforward about it.
Yeah, and even further, the politics of Curtis Yarvin are, for me, difficult to fully take up and decipher because he seems to be, when I was looking over, I looked at the link provided to Yarvin's work, which was this piece called Patchwork, A Political System for the 21st Century. It's not exactly clear when Yarvin is taking a pot shot at the system as it is and when he's espousing what he really wants to develop. I mean, I think he really does want some of these things that are draconian and totalitarian to develop, but I think he takes much more pleasure in writing about this society as it is, as also totalitarian and draconian. And as I read his piece, the difference between his vision of a future San Francisco and the one we have today was there, but it wasn't, so clear. So,
and even supposing that Yarvin is a Jacobite and that Vance, because he takes Thiel bucks, is therefore also a Jacobite, and then that Vance does become president, does that mean that he can do Jacobitism through the American state? Yeah, there's a bunch of further questions you then have to ask about what will actually concretely occur. And I think very frequently, if somebody has said something, or if somebody has in some way been associated with somebody or something in the past, people are very quick to jump to what this must mean for what is going to happen. And this is, I think, to come back to a theme here, there's this problem in American politics of equating things people say or things, people that you're associated with a possibility of action. And this was a major part of what went wrong with the Democrats' whole strategy with regard to Trump. This assumption that things that Trump said were necessarily indicative of action, and that voters could be persuaded that that was the case. And this is why they so often found themselves arguing, Trump's going to do this, Trump's going to do that, and voters were not convinced of this. And I think that this article also suffers to some degree from this problem. There is this tendency to assume that we know what people are going to do based on things that they've said or based on associations that they have. And then to hyperventilate and go, oh my God, they're going to ruin democracy over very, very small speech acts or associative relationships. Somebody talks to somebody, somebody meets with somebody, somebody retweets somebody else. Therefore, they must be committed to a bunch of action. And the thing that stands out to me about American politics is how little action there actually is. So many people who we're told have all of these crazy, wild beliefs don't do anything, either because they can't or because they don't actually believe the things that they're being accused of believing. Whichever one it is, we shouldn't be taking all of it so seriously to the point of causing it to stop us from thinking. Because a lot of it is thought terminating. A lot of it is, well, if somebody is associated with something or if somebody said something, then you have to wig out about them, treat them like they're Hitler or Joseph Stalin, and do whatever is necessary to thwart them. And this is not, these people don't even really want to see people do whatever is necessary to thwart them. As soon as it starts to get hot, people like Joe Biden will say, you won the election, welcome back. They're not really interested in generating the kind of response they pretend they'd like to see.
Well, the claims that the Democrats made regarding Trump's aim to be a dictator and to subvert the institutions and to instigate a policy of vengeance and lawfare were being undermined by their own activity, and had been undermined by their own activity over the previous year. Because what people were paying attention noticed was the Democrats are attempting to use the judiciary for political means to do damage to their political opponent through the courts. They're instigating policy of lawfare, and it is failing. And the institutions themselves are resilient enough to stand up to it and to correct a bit. Whether or not you agree with the Supreme Court decision to grant more immunity to the president, it was a reaction to the lawfare that was going on, and there was a balance of power. And in the end, Trump was elected despite the Democrats' efforts to take total control of the administrative state and the state and thwart him, in these corrupt ways. So, one question that might rise for a voter is, well, why should I take this so seriously when I've seen you make the very effort you're accusing Trump of intending to make, and seeing you fail at it? Maybe I believe in America more than you do. Maybe I believe in these institutions more than you do. So that was another product, I think, of the election.
Yeah. I think I'm hesitant to take either side of it entirely literally. I think that right now it's become extremely politically lucrative to claim that the other side is trying to destroy democracy or do authoritarianism, precisely because both sides have so little positively to offer. Both sides are doing very, very little that anybody actually would like to see. Most of these presidents, when they come in within the first year, their approval ratings are in the toilet because the 2 or 3 things they've done, each of which are pretty mild, really, has been quite unpopular. In the case of Trump, the 2017 tax cut, and then the attempt to repeal and replace the ACA. In the case of Biden, the human infrastructure bill, the Build Back Better plan. In the case of Obama, the Affordable Care Act and the stimulus. Each of these things ends up being much smaller than the people who advocate for these things wanted initially. And then they generate so much negative feedback that these people then have a hard time going into their midterm elections, sustaining the relevant numbers in Congress to go on and continue doing stuff. So we tend to see very little actually happen. And yet, oh my God, every election they act like there's more at stake, when I think really there's less. There's less at stake in each of these elections rather than more.
Well, isn't one of the reasons that we see so little happen is because most of what happens within the government happens on the level of administrative rules and within the permanent bureaucracy rather than through the Congress?
Well, I think that part of the complaint about the bureaucracy is that it gets in the way and doesn't do very much. Just like part of the complaint about Congress is that it gets in the way and doesn't do very much. If you ask the Democrats what's wrong with the Congress, it's that it doesn't legislate, and therefore it stops the administrators from doing the things they need to do. And this forces the executive branch to do more through executive action. And if you ask the Republicans will say that it's the administrators who are the sticks in the mud, who obstruct the Congress with the way that they interpret legislative acts, and that they're the reason that nothing ever happens. It's all become a debate about which part of the American state you blame for the fact that nothing ever gets done.
Well, let's we have this short story. I'm gonna just let you get the last word on that and think about it a bit. Maybe we can bring that up again in a future episode, because I was more concerned about the abuses of power that the Democrats were making over the last 4 years, and you appear to be. So maybe we can bring that up again. But yeah, we have this short story that we read. It was Donald Barthleme's story entitled "Some of Us Have Been Threatening Our Friend Colby," which I have admired for quite a while. It just seems to be more and more relevant or descriptive of our lived reality all the time. It's the story of a group of friends who decide that a man named Colby had gone too far, and so they needed to hang him. And then the description of how Colby is cajoled into going along with this, how the friends orchestrate it tastefully, how they send out invitations on cream-colored paper. They deal with some of the technical details, and in the end, the event comes off swimmingly. But what did you make of the story? Have you read Donald Barthleme before? Are you aware of him as an author?
I wouldn't claim to know his biography or anything like that. I very much liked the short story, the wonderful contrast between the barbarism of the hanging and the civility with which it's done.
Mm-hmm.
That really does make it sing.
Yeah, right. These are very sophisticated, urbane, erudite, privileged people on the East Coast, I think. And they simply have had enough from this fellow Colby, who is a friend of theirs and who they have some moral claim to. So they decide to take him out. I actually, reading it again today, I thought, in a way, this sort of barbarism is in advance over the kind of barbarism that we deal with online. Like, people are polite to Colby. They give him they allow him to select what kind of music he wants to have performed at his hanging. They don't completely dehumanize him. They don't accuse him of anything beyond what he himself will agree to, which is that he's gone too far. But there's not an attempt to do complete reputational destruction to the man, but simply to deal with the infraction. So in a way, it is more civilized time.
Well, there's action, and the discussion around the action is calm, but then there's wild and crazy action, whereas we have the polar opposite of this. We have wild and crazy language and then very little that actually transpires. But the wild and crazy language allows the very little to continue to transpire.
Right. So, but wait a minute.
It has the opposite effect of what it purports to have. The wilder and crazier the language becomes, the less actually occurs.
Well, but we do have Luigi Manigoni, or whatever this guy's name is. We have the extreme action out there in the world from time to time. We had
murder, something which occurs every day in the United States, over and over and over again. We have, compared to Europe, 5 times the murder rate per capita. So, I get Chicago TV news. If I turn on the TV, I put on WGN, the lead story is always, who got murdered today? Why should this murder get more coverage than any other murder? Because of a possible political motivation? Who really cares? At the end of the day, we're just talking about murder. And murder in the United States is a very banal thing.
Well, It also looked like something out of a movie. You can't ignore that fact. You know, he looked like he was a hitman, and there was a narrative to it that made it sing. You know, but the other thing is that in the some of us have been threatening our friend Colby's story. It is also a murder, right? It's not really an officially sanctioned hanging of a criminal. It's a murder of a man by a group of friends.
Right. And then once it's done, there's no need to put it on television or to post about it on social media. There's some commentary at the end about how it went well, and then that's it. It's over with.
Right. What the guy says at the end is, it didn't rain, the event was well attended, and we didn't run out of scotch or anything. The two things I remember best about the whole episode are the grateful look Colby gave me when he said that when I said what I said about the wire, in other words, that they shouldn't hang him using a wire. And the other thing that you remember best about it is the fact that nobody has ever gone too far again after that, after the public hanging there. So, yeah, and that's it. So they solved the problem. There was action, and it resolves a dynamic within the friend group so that people would be more obedient and more socially acceptable in the future, at least for a time enough for this story to have been written up. So, yeah, I long yet again for the 70s when we could have a nice, civilized hanging rather than these public cancellations online. Those were a time when friends, looked out for each other.
Well, to a large degree, we're repeating the 70s in a more farcical way. A lot of the political tendencies, the ways of talking and thinking from the 70s are back in vogue, but with a lower level of civility and with much less willingness on the part of people to carry the arguments through to their conclusions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what do you think about that? About the way people are unwilling to stick with an argument and see where it goes. Even in academic circles, they tend not to do that, it seems to me.
Yeah, arguments don't have the kind of causal force that I think people have historically assumed that they have. They've lost that. I think in the past, they perhaps used to have that, and that's why there is this presumption that if you speak in a particular way, it will motivate action. But I think that that is no longer the case. I think a lot of this talking no longer has the implications that it historically would have appeared to have had in different situations or settings. And so instead, a lot of this talking has other effects that we are not tracking and anticipating. And I think that some of what you were saying about pseudo-activity gets at some of the effects. But I do think, there was a comment about, doesn't this reflect actual antagonisms in terms of values? And I think that that's true. I think that part of what has happened is that we've reached a point where we're so incapable of revolutionary organizing that disagreements don't produce that effect. And therefore, disagreements can continue to develop and grow past the point at which, in earlier periods, they would have produced some kind of revolutionary upsurge or social organizing. And then the disagreements penetrate so far that they themselves become an obstacle to the social organizing, right? If you try to get together with a bunch of people, these culture war issues that get kicked around in the mainstream culture, they come into your social group and they cause trouble and they cause disagreement and coordination problems. We've reached a stage where we are disagreeing very, very often about a lot of things that are not particularly germane or important to the political action that we are looking to take. But nonetheless, we are not able to sort or organize or make priorities. So once these disagreements come up, we act as if they mean we can't work with people.
Yeah. Well, Spencer Leonard asked why I selected this short story. He says, what, Doug, did you think the connection to the short story was between the pseudo-event, presentation and this short story by Barthleme? And what I thought was that the Barthleme story was about enforcing speech codes or enforcing kind of etiquette on Colby through violence, through murder, in a way that was comical, but also illustrative of what happened when arguments aren't privileged or aren't considered to be a path towards not just resolving political problems, but also living together, reasoning together. When public reason is dropped away, and what we have instead is the enforcement of etiquette or enforcement of a certain kind of narratives, or identities or self-conceptions. Because what Colby did was go too far, which means he said something that everybody thought was dreadful. We don't know what he said, but he didn't. It is not clear to me that he actually acted in some way, or like he robbed someone, or did something that was illegal. It was a social faux pas that created a situation where he had to be hung, or they thought he did. And so I felt like this story was a comical illustration of a kind of mentality, a cultural tendency that was around in the 70s and had only developed and intensified since then. Might have been a kind of sensibility that was amongst the most educated elites in the 70s, in which now we're all asked to participate in and to share. So that's what I thought the connection was, Spencer. We've reached the hour. Presented a lot. Surely it was infinitely more difficult to organize a socialist worker movement in the period when it was illegal under Bismarck than it is today. This is not really aimed at me. I think that people are talking to each other there. Yeah, let's go over to the parrot room. It will start at, I'm going to start at 10:25, about 25 minutes. Benjamin, you're going to be there in the second half? Great. And we'll just talk about what we talked about in the first half, and then about the campaign for a socialist party and what's on our minds. So hopefully be a bunch of us. There's a link to Zoom on the Patreon, and I look forward to seeing everybody in just a bit. I'm going to go refill my coffee.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living